Well, good evening, everybody. It, According to my watch and that clock, we're ready to start, so I hope you are too. We have a very interesting program this evening. My name is Clark Presley. I'm a past president of the Venice Area Historical Society, and I was not going to be in this capacity this evening. I was going to be sitting out there with everybody else, but our president, Frank Wright, turned a little under the weather this week, and so he's at home recuperating and staying secluded somewhat. So anyway, so I'm here to fill in for him. And we've got kind of a full program because we've got some special activities here. I want, again, to say welcome and hope that I'll mention the fact that we're going to be having one more live program next month in June. And we hope you return for that. And there's already publicity on our website, and you may see other messages about what will take place. It's all on the theme of historic preservation, and I'm looking forward to next month's program as well, because the speaker, Dorothy Corwick, will be filling us in on the John Nolan plan for Venice, Florida. And it's a major subject for those of us that live here and get involved with the local history, and for those that are on the island that actually live in the district. So anyway, looking forward to a good program with the authority on the John Nolan plan. Let's see, what else do I want to talk? Oh, yes, I have to say, this is part of the Betty and Tagliata lecture series. And Betty had long-term plans to be up in Connecticut, and so she's gone this week. And so we don't have her with us, but hopefully she's having a good time visiting family. Connecticut was her home area before she came down here. And the Betty and Tagliata lecture series was formed by the Society, and today we are blessed to have it funded in perpetuity. That's a long time. By Dr. William Jervey. Bill Jervey's foundation is our funding source for this program, and we thank you for that, Bill. Very much appreciated. Right. I also want to just pay quick tribute to all the others in the organization that support this activity, from the parking attendants that you may have met as you pulled into the driveway, to the people who greet near the door here, the ones that support and provide the refreshments that we have, and others that play a background role in making this event happen. And we're an all-volunteer organization, so none of these things would be taking place without people willing to spend their personal time doing the service that they do. And we really do appreciate that. I want to mention one other thing first off. Carol Bailey will be out there. She has a table, and she is going to be selling books that we acquired from Dr. Bruce Stevenson, a college professor who was here for the walking tour in mid-March, I believe it was, for the pocket parks, certain ones in the city of Venice. And it was a very meaningful excursion for those that were able to attend. And he has written a book called John Nolan, Landscape Architect and City Planner. And we now have copies of this book, and they are autographed. Yep, here it is, under his name. And they are going to be available for sale after the program tonight out in the vestibule. And we hope that they're $30 each, cash or check only. We can't handle credit cards at the moment. So if you're interested, there might be enough to cover the requests that come floating into Carol this evening. So that'll be after the service. And after we've adjourned in here, feel free to go out there, have some light refreshments, and if you're interested, check out this book. I also want to give thanks to the staff of the Unitarian Universalist Sanctuary here for making this space available to us on a regular basis for these programs, and for the support that they provide in helping to set this place up so that we can host the meeting, and hopefully you're sitting in comfortable chairs and situated so that you can see what there is to see throughout this evening, including the program itself. Now, the next thing is a special activity that we only get to do once a year, and it's this time of the year. And for the discussion about that, I'm going to invite my colleague, Tom Bowers, to come up and make a couple of presentations. Tom?
Hey, thank you, Clark. I'm a former educator and served as a chair of the Education Committee for the Historical Society. I have the esteemed honor to present this evening our scholarship recipients that are sponsored by two esteemed members, and the Historical Society is fortunate enough they allow us to share in this opportunity. So, without further ado, let me get started very, very quickly here. We have a Sue Chapman Scholarship recipient this evening, and we work with the Rotary Futures at the high school. They screen candidates. It's a phenomenal department there at the high school. Last evening, they gave the largest amount of scholarship money for future great people, over $13 million. Wow. Anyway, our recipient for the Sue Chapman Scholarship is Catherine Visner. Catherine will be attending Belmont College in Nashville, Tennessee, with a goal to major in psychology and ultimately get her PhD in child psychology. She's a member of Advanced Placement and International Baccalaureate classes, known as AP and IB, okay? She has also been awarded the Renaissance Award for Academic Leadership. Katie is a scholar. However, she wants to be remembered by you all for what she has in the way of strength of character, core beliefs, values, and kindness. She has tutored children who otherwise would not have the resources to pay for those services. Additionally, because of her background with horses and equine expertise, Katie is with the InStride Equestrian Assisted Therapy class. What that does is they have disabled, mentally and physically disabled children, veterans, PTSD people that ride horses for therapy. And Katie is a part of that program. And I think it's just a phenomenal deal. It helps them with gaining confidence and balance issues. Katie wants to be the light at the end of the tunnel for a child and family. And finally, Jennifer Kuhn, her International Baccalaureate Language and Literature teacher, during her junior year stated this: Katie will most certainly be a student who I will be able to say, I knew her when. There's no doubt in my mind that she will do extraordinary things. Now, with Katie this evening is her grandmother, Debbie Jackman. And without further ado, Katie Catherine Visner. Catherine? I have to say this. I'm from Indiana, a fellow Hoosier. Just found out that Miss Jackman is from French Lick, Indiana, and just happened to be in the same graduating class as Larry Bird. You know, what do you think, huh? Oh, well. Hey, our next scholarship person, and I just want to mention, and I should be one to talk, but any one of us old people, could sponsor a scholarship for a person. You know, we could go together. You know, talk to me, anything. I just think it's such a wonderful, wonderful deal when we have such outstanding students throughout our community, and certainly here this evening. Dr. William Jervey's scholarship recipient this year is William L. Harless. Now, William is a native Michigander and hails, though, from Huntington, West Virginia, and came to Venice with his mother to help care for his grandmother. He intends to major in international foreign relations. William is also enrolled in AP, Advanced Placement, IB, International Baccalaureate classes. You need to understand what that means. They could choose honor classes, they could choose standard classes, these two. But they chose the absolute toughest route that they could to excel and to challenge themselves. And that's quite a distinction, I believe. William is one of 25 students in our United States selected to be a part of the Stanford Rush Hour Scholars. It's called a SPICE program. And he's learning all aspects of Japan: religion, philosophy, education, economy, and countless other fields related to that country. Because, by the way, William is bilingual and is conversant in Japanese. Anyway, he is also speech and debate co-captain. And while you and I were here navigating the perils of a pandemic throughout the last 2.5 years, William was at Cincinnati Children's Hospital last year having brain surgery. William proudly says that he is a Chiari, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, a Chiari warrior. Chiari is a brain disease that can be disabling. And it's quite a deal. Teachers that work with William mention the fact that, well, the adjectives they use are resilient, perseverance, positive outlook, strong leader, helpful. I didn't see the adjective complainer. William has been accepted to many colleges and universities. His selection is imminent. It is possible we are meeting our future diplomat to the country of Japan. With William, I am honored to present Dr. William Jervey. And Dr. Jervey, would you please come forward? I'll let you do the honors here, presenting this to William. Come forward. This is William Harless. That's my part. Thank you.
for special events, you can never have enough photos. Thank you, Tom. And again, our congratulations to both of the recipients. Well deserved. Let's see, I'm ready to talk about who is coming up to speak to us. Gentleman's name is Gary Youngberg. Gary's a Venice native and a 1972 Venice High School graduate. He attended Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, studying radio engineering. His post-educational experience included a 4-month spell in West Africa on a technology project. That had to be challenging. In the late 70s, he relocated to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he got his work with a family-owned business as a chimney sweep. That's not something that we have in high demand around here that I know of. There are no chimneys in my neighborhood, but anyway. But that led to Gary founding his own company to provide that service to his own budding group of clientele. And he obviously did well. It kept him busy until he elected to retire in 2017 and come back to his hometown of Venice, Florida. Gary's varied interests include aviation, amateur radio communications, audio-video engineering, local history research, and preservation. He's currently a volunteer on the Lord Heigl House project and assists with maintenance of Old Betsy, the city's historic 1926 American LaFrance fire engine. And I assume that most, if not all, of the people in this room at one time or another have seen Old Betsy trotting up and down the road, particularly for special events like holiday parades and things of that nature. And finally, Gary also serves on the planning committee for the Old Timers Picnic, an annual event that's been going on probably since the old timers were young timers. I'm not sure. Gary is the grandson of George E. Youngberg Sr. His grandfather worked as an engineer, civil engineer in the development of the city of Venice. That's an interesting connection to have in your family. When George Sr. was a member of the staff of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers who built that beautiful city. And after that brief summation of his background, I am going to ask Gary to come and address his program on some of the homes that didn't survive the last few decades. Gary Youngberg.
Thanks, Clark. One of the greatest blessings in my life was growing up here in Venice and having my mother and father, who were at the time in the early 50s, was living in Rochester, New York, made the decision to return here to Venice, and that gave me the privilege of being born here locally. And I greatly appreciate that fact. I'm going to introduce you to a great friend of mine, Alec Ronald, who is at the AV section there. He is my boss, where I work at Venice Presbyterian Church. I'm glad he is because he knows what he's doing. One other fact about Alec, his great-grandmother and great-grandfather were here in Venice in the 1920s. Excuse me, actually his great-grandmother was. And his great-grandmother was Betty Hauser Arnell, who is the originator of our archives and historical collection. So that is a magnificent trace. My grandparents knew Alec's great-great-grandparents. That's how that works out. And with that being said, I'd like to dedicate tonight's presentation to my mother and father, who would be George Jr. and Helen Youngberg, and my grandfather, George Sr. and Helen Youngberg. Both my mother and my grandmother were both Helen Youngbergs. rather. So we thank you. I'll take a moment to go back there. We'll turn out the lights and we'll switch the system on. We'll be sharing some images and thoughts and remembrances of days gone by from the buildings that we had. I think we're ready. At the turn of the century, the railroad system in Florida was developing at a rapid rate. Henry Morrison Flagler was developing the railroad system of Florida's East Coast, south to Miami, and eventually to the Florida Keys. On Florida's west coast, the railroad came to Sarasota in 1903, and the Sarasota Depot was constructed. About 1910, Mrs. Bertha Honore Palmer traveled from Chicago to the Osprey community in the South Sarasota and began her legacy developments here. There is no doubt that she traveled by the railroad. Shortly, Mrs. Palmer made a request to the Seaboard Railroad requesting that the rail line be extended from southward from Sarasota to the Venice community. Her request was effective as the Seaboard did as she asked, and the railroad extension to Venice was completed in 1911. 3 simple wooden structures were built to serve the passenger freight and postal mail needs of the Venice community. The current day location of these buildings today would be very close to the front of the Venice Theater on Tampa Avenue. In 1924, Dr. Fred Albee, the investor in Venice, Nokomis area, retained city planner John Nolan to do a site study and draft a development plan for a city that was to become the original Venice. By the time Mr. Nolan completed the initial drafts of the Venice plans, Dr. Albee was approached by several officials of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. The Brotherhood showed interest in purchasing from Dr. Albee his holdings in Venice. The BLE's offer to the doctor must have been too good to refuse. The result that was Dr. Albee sold his holdings to the BLE with the understanding that John Nolan's plan would be used to develop what was to become the new Venice. This deal became official in the summer of 1925. Mr. Nolan's plan required that the rail line would need to be moved eastward 1/4 of a mile to the proposed site of the new depot. The original 3 small wooden structures were no longer needed, and a new railroad depot was to be built and placed into service. These 3 structures that we just saw would be the first buildings that we lost. And here's what the new railroad station looked like in March of 1927. It cost a magnificent $48,000 to build it. And of course, there was a promotional for the Venice community and the Seaboard. And this is what the station looked like shortly after it was opening. It was very attractive, and of course, a lot of folks traveled through it. And we're going to show you a few images of the station interior. The latest in electronic communication equipment of the day. Unfortunately, during the latter part of 1927 and 1928, the Brotherhood's project in Venice experienced serious financial reverses as the Florida land boom was over. The city of Venice, which was chartered in 1927, was deeply impacted by the project failure and was left to operate with a very slight budget. During this time, the city treasury was so depleted that the streetlights were turned off on moonlit nights. In 1931, officials with the Kentucky Military Institute in Linden, Kentucky, contacted one of the city councilmen, the Honorable Bud Wimmers, to see if there was any available facility space in Venice that the KMI could use. Mr. Whitmer said, yes, there are 2 empty hotels here. Come on down and take a look, which they did. So in early 1932, the entire school, the cadets and staff, arrived on the Seaboard Airline Railroad, and they came back to Venice each winter season until 1970. For the years they were here, they supported and graced the city, especially through the Depression. And the local girls enjoyed their company too. How about that? At this time, we're going to show you some film from Venice from 1950. Enjoy this. By the way, this is silent. Yeah, this is Cecil B. DeMille. And a few months after this film was made, he was in Sarasota filming The Greatest Show on Earth, the famous and legendary movie about the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. Isn't this marvelous? This is one small fraction of the resources at our museum and archives. Extraordinary. And the goodbyes. The 1960s. And a special thing happened in Venice in December of 1960. The 60s were a kinder time in Venice with the coming of the Ringling Brothers Circus. They came here from Sarasota. The circus was in Venice until 1993, and they made use of the Venice Depot during arrivals and departures. As a child, I remember the parade when the elephants and the other animals were moved from the depot down the Tamiami Trail into the brand new circus arena. And I remember asking my father, I was about 6 years of age then, and I asked my dad when we were watching this, well, they're walking the elephants, but why don't they walk the lions and the tigers? And later, after the canal was finished and the relocation of the railroad line, you had the elephants crossing the bridge. That's the original South Bridge in 1967 that we now call the Circus Bridge. And another railroad depot-related event that I remember very well was a field trip that we took to Sarasota when I was in the 2nd grade. The Venice Elementary School was just right next door to the depot. There was no canal between the school and where the depot is, so it was just a simple walk onto Venice Avenue to the train station. We took the train from Venice up to Sarasota, and I don't remember what we did much there, but I remember the trip, the riding of the train very, very well. I think that I am the little fellow up on the right-hand side with his hand near his face in the plaid shirt. I think that's me. Once upon a time. That is the Doodlebug locomotive, which was an electric hybrid locomotive used mostly for the passenger use. And a few other scenes here in the 1960s. That's a close-up of the Doodlebug. The Doodlebug was an electric diesel combination that we would sometimes call a hybrid that was used for pulling passenger trains. It was a lot more economical to operate than the heavier locomotives that used for the long freight trains. And that's what the station looked like just before 1970. Not long after this picture was taken in 1970, passenger service at the depot ceased. And freight service at the Venice depot was discontinued in the late 1980s. And the depot and its property fell into decline and abandonment. And the reason I wanted to include the depot in this program this evening is because it was almost lost. It could have easily failed the preservation, but some very remarkable things that took place. And we can see how desperately poor a condition it was in. Somebody came to the rescue. Someone that we knew and we appreciated years ago. At this time, we're going to let Jack Perkins introduce and tell the story about this magnificent individual.
This is the new old train station in Venice. You might not know it from looking at it now, but for years this place was abandoned and falling apart.
For some artists, there's quite an appeal to a derelict building in decay. Paintings of what used to be the old train depot in Venice, paintings by local artists and by internationally renowned artists. The Canadian Robert Bateman came to Venice a few years ago to capture this radiant memory.
I've never seen another depot like this. It is very unique. It's an interesting asymmetrical form, which is unusual. It doesn't have kind of really classical form, and I think that was intentional. They wanted to have the first view of Venice being something that was really special and really unique, so people would realize they were coming to a very special place. This building is somewhat unique in terms of railroad depots. The depot buildings are very small, yet it had over 9,000 square feet of canopy space. It really introduced to people to the tropical environment here in Florida.
After decades of use, the Venice depot reached the end of the line. Neglected, it became a broken-down relic, out of place, out of time. Then along came Rollins Coakley. This retired railroader decided to save the structure and restore it to its original form.
Rollins, when we see you around town, you're not dressed like that.
Right. Well, the reason for that is as I am one of the tour guides for the depot. And currently the Venice Area Historical Society are conducting tours of the building, and it's been very successful. I think to date they've had over, or maybe close to 1,000 people that have come down here to take the tour.
82 years old, Rollins Coakley is taking it easy these days. An occasional walk around the grounds with visitors is his speed. He invested 19 years in this project. The actual restoration phase lasted 2 years, but when it was completed, it was as though the hands of time had been spun back to 1927.
Describe what this train station used to be like back in the heydays.
Well, the train depot was built in 1926 by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. at a time that they were building the city of Venice, and it was a passenger and freight station and remained as such from 1926 until the present time. And during that period, following 1926, it served a number of very important functions, one of which was that it brought the Kentucky military cadets down here for their winter quarters in January and February. Then it also served to bring military personnel and supplies during World War II when they had the Army Air Base here where they trained fighter pilots. And then, of course, for over 30 years, this was the winter quarters of the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus.
Rollins, describe for me what it must have been like when the circus train arrived in town.
The circus trains would come down here in January, to go down to Center Road with their equipment. They would march the animals from that point, Center Road, over the South Bridge, now known as the Circus Bridge, over the bridge into the arena quarters. And people used to come from all over to watch that performance.
For 30 years, Venice was the winter home of the circus. It was also the home of Ringling's famed animal trainer Gunther Gable Williams until he passed away in 2001. A statue honoring that extraordinary showman is being constructed and will eventually be placed on display at the depot.
I was trying to capture the spirit of Gunther. To me, he seems like a happy man that loved his work and loved his animals and loved people, and I wanted all of that to come through in the sculpture.
Now, to a lot of people, this seems like a wonderful example of how one man, one small group, can make a heck of a difference in a community.
Well, I feel good about my role because it wasn't the only person. I wasn't the only person. There were others, but I had the time. I was retired. I had the love for the building. I had the railroad background. So it was a labor of love for me, believe me.
How incredibly fortunate we are. That's Rollins and his family. They chose just the right name for the park. And the depot's been used for historical events. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful compared to what it looked like? Yes. And our home for the Historical Society. We're going to go down the street, we're going to go to Venice Avenue, and we're going to cross into the downtown core of Venice on the north side of Venice Avenue. And the area that we're going to focus on is between Venice Avenue's intersection with Nassau Street and Harbor Drive. We're at the Venice Avenue intersection with Harbor Drive, and we're looking at the Hotel Park View, which is now where the post office is located. The next building that was built during the BLE days was the El Prado Theater building that you see on the far right. And we're going to go to the opposite corner, so we're going to go back to the view from Nassau Street to Venice Avenue. Obviously, we're having this picture taken from the second-story elevation. The Venice Nokomis Bank is the third building. All three of these buildings were lost. The Venice Nokomis Bank, as a point of reference, the site is now the site of the daiquiri deck. We'll let you study that for just a moment. because it looks radically different. We're going to start with the Parkview Hotel. That's what it looked like in 1926 when it opened. It had a hurried beginning. I'm going to read something, actually tell you something that my grandfather explained to me some years ago, and I wish I would have listened for a bit more detail. My grandfather told me years ago about how this second hotel was planned. The Hotel Venice was the first hotel. He said people that were coming here to Venice in droves, and there wasn't enough hotel space to go around. Some of the rooms of the Venice Hotel, which is the first one, were tied up with offices used by the Brotherhood. My grandfather got a phone call late one night from Mr. Webb, who would be the project superintendent, telling him to come down to the hotel for an important business meeting right now at night. At this meeting, the architect said that the plans for the next hotel would take 90 days to complete. And Mr. Webb said, "We can't wait that long. What can we do?" So late at night, it was decided to use the plans they already had on hand for the Hotel Venice. That's the article that my grandfather wrote explaining this. So that's the Hotel Venice, which is now the retirement community just opposite the Catholic Church. The plans were modified somewhat for the second hotel, and this is what it looked like in comparison. I'm going to back click to. They were in a time bind, and that's how they got around it, by using the plans for the second hotel, which was later named the Hotel Parkview. They put an annex across the front of it, and they changed the shape of the towers. Other than that, the buildings were structurally identical. The meeting finally finished at 4 o'clock in the morning. And when the sun came up, my grandfather and his engineering staff were at the site staking out the boundaries. Then construction started at once. The new hotel was named the Hotel Parkview, and it was built at a cost of $500,000 and finished in record time. Here's some of the interior pictures of the Parkview: the lunch counter and the dining room. And meeting and social space in the main annex. That was what you were looking at the frontage of the building a moment ago. And there was a commemorative luncheon that was commemorating, I know that it's a little bit hard to read the font, but that font says Mayor Ned Worthington. He was the first mayor of Venice. The Parkview closed about 1930 due to the Great Depression. In 1932, Dr. Fred Albee purchased the Parkview and opened the Florida Medical Center. The Florida Medical Center was in operation from 1932 until 1942. In 1942, the Florida Medical Center was taken over by the Army Department of War. It was used as the base hospital for the Venice Army Airfield until the end of the war. And it eventually reopened in the late 1940s. It was given the name of the Gulf Breeze. I vaguely remember telephone numbers being that short. And that's this frontage viewed from Harbor Drive at Venice Avenue. It hosted many children's parties. And by the way, the lady in the middle is my mother, including Christmas parties with Santa Claus. And young people's musical events. And of course, the Lions Club, which met there for years. And we had an outdoor festival that commemorated the 1980s. And that's the Gulf Breeze in the background. George and Irene, that was one of your slides, by the way. Towards the latter part of its existence, it was used as a senior apartment hotel for the retired and the elderly. And included one of the lowest prices laundry that you'll ever see. In 1964, this very important and sad article came out in the Gondolier. Yeah, and it had to go away. That was in 1965 in the summer. Only 38 years of age. And a few months later in the Gondolier, that was very interesting to see. But it never came. We don't know exactly what happened, but apparently investors didn't exactly see eye to eye, and it just never developed. So what we could have seen had it been preserved, we would see something like this today. But instead, we see this. The next building we're going to commemorate is the El Prado Theater. And this is what the theater building looked like in 1927. On the far right, you'll see three arches. You see two of them, actually. One of them, a tree is in front of one of them. That is the entrance to the theater. And you had then 6 spaces for a small store to, in the remainder of it, going from the right to the left. I'm going to read something from an article that my grandfather wrote in 1954, which commemorated the opening of the theater. The theater, which opened to the public on July the 14th, 1927, was regarded as one of the finest theaters on the west coast of Florida. It was designed and decorated to create a feeling of old Spain. The lobby was decorated with flowers and palms. The feature picture of the opening night was the bells. Its main character was Lionel Barrymore. You ever see him look so young? This was the first showing of the picture of the state of Florida, not just Venice, but the whole state. A telegram was sent by Mr. Barrymore, which was read from the stage. The capacity crowd which filled the theater on its opening night, remained long after the performance to admire the unique beauty of the theater. And we had a matinee, a free matinee for a rather large group of young children. I've not seen this picture until about 3 weeks ago, and I was fascinated by it because I knew that my father and my two aunts, and perhaps even Mrs. Julia Cousins Lanning and Betty Hauser-Arnell could have been in that picture as a small child. I looked around, but the images were too small. And by the way, the caption says that was some of the children. Not all. In the 1950s, it was renamed the Gulf Theater after a change in management. And some of the legendary films were shown. This was one of the most remarkable pictures ever taken of the Gulf Theater. It was so remarkable that they made a color postcard out of it. And the 1890s festival was celebrated right there on Venice Avenue. And a close view of its frontage. And they had Christmas parties complete with Santa. And these two pictures are probably the only interior pictures taken of the Gulf Theater. And this is what it looked like with the new marquee in the 1960s. And I remember watching a number of films there as a child. The first one I watched, I remember especially well, was Walt Disney's The Absent-Minded Professor. I was so fascinated by it that I persuaded my mother and father to let me go and see it again. And then my mother started calling me the absent-minded professor. And the last movie I watched there was this one, Airport 1970. It was not long after that this is probably one of the last professional photographs taken of the Gulf Theater. Because the following year, it was gone at 44 years of age. You know, I looked in the Gondolier newspaper to see if there was much about it. There wasn't much mentioned as to the reason why, except this. We are wrecking the Gulf Theater and apartments, have all kinds of salvage material for sale. It was kind of a sad ending. And now we're at the Venice Nokomis Bank, which is the today's site of the Daiquiri Deck. It was owned by Dr. Albee, and it was opened in 1927. Actually, the bank was formed in 1925, and it came to Venice in 1927. I just remembered Evergreen's restaurant was the first site of the bank in Nokomis before it moved to Venice. Brand new. And the center of commerce. James Thomas Blaylock, or Jim Tom as he was called. He was the manager cashier of the Venice Nokomis Bank, and through the efforts of he and his very, very small administrative staff, the Venice Nokomis Bank did not close during the Depression. It survived it. The only one in Sarasota County to survive the Depression. Jim Tom Blaylock was, I believe, was the second mayor of Venice, or the third mayor.
After Dr. Albee passed away, Dr. Albee was the gentleman who opened the bank in the first place. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Baynard, seen here in front of the bank at the 1890s commemoration, became the owners of the bank. And Bob Baynard, throughout the latter half of the 40s and the 50s, helped to bring Venice back and help it to revive. That was one of the interesting circumstances that persuaded my grandparents to move back here in 1948. The 1890s festival, and that's Dr. and Mrs. Talmadge Thompson, our family doctor, and one of the 4 doctors that founded the Venice Hospital in the 50s. This is kind of a little bit more of how I would remember it in 65. But the next picture is one of the most beautiful I've ever seen. The Gulf Theater was still open when this picture was taken. And on many evenings, after I would step out of the theater, after my friends and I after we saw a picture, we'd walk right past the bank and then across the street to the Dick and Meadows drugstore, to the soda fountain. Those were memories. And it's also gone. We're going to go to the beach now, and this is the original bathhouse that was constructed by the BLE. That's correct, Dr. Albee. Now, it was not at the location of where the current beach facilities are. It was probably about a quarter of a mile north of there. It was actually very, very close to the intersection of the Esplanade and Tarpon Center Drive. You drive right past that on your way to the yacht club or to the Crow's Nest. This is the side that faced the Gulf. The style of the day. The gentleman on the left is Henry Hauser. And Henry Hauser is Alec's great-great-great-grandfather. And we even had a bathing beauties contest. The original beach house was damaged by a hurricane in the 1930s. The Venice Beach Casino was the next structure, and it was built to take its place, and it was actually at the site of our current-day pavilion. And the interesting fact about the Venice Beach Pavilion is that the second story of it housed the city offices before we had a city hall. So your city offices were in that upstairs of the building. Now that's before I remembered, but that's so I'm told. And this was shortly before it went away. But there's one of the fun things I remember there as a child, the rock pile party. Where did all those rocks come from? Well, the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts, of which I was one, and a bunch of the kids would don their swimsuits and face masks and would go into the shallows of the water and look for every rock that people would stub their toe on and piled them up in teams, and the team that got the biggest rock pile won a prize of some sort. It was so much fun. An interesting fact about the Venice Beach Casino was the second beach house built in Venice. It was built in the 1930s by Mitt Cousins, the father of Julia Cousins Lanning. It was torn down in 1963 and replaced by our current beach pavilion, seen under construction here. That's sort of what it looks like today. Well, this concludes our time here with Memories Gone By. I grew up on Menendez Street, which is just away from Park Boulevard, and it's off of Park Boulevard, not far from Venice Avenue, about 2 blocks south of Venice Avenue. And the house is still there. When my dad came to the position to where the house needed to be sold, he sold it to someone who would not demolish it. And the house was built in 1951, and I came along in 1954. So it was my childhood home.
Where is the Point of Palms, and what's the name of it today?
Point of Palms, is that the, that's in Nokomis, isn't it?
That's what you said, the Albee Estate?
Yes.
That's right, it's that same street. Sunset?
It's Colonia.
Sunset Road. It's right at the end, I think it's 200, 201, something like that.
Dorothy? Yeah.
Another, if you want to look at real estate, you just go to the Sarasota County website and go to the assessor or whatever and look at the map. It's a Google Earth image, and you can zoom in and zoom out and see what people's properties besides seeing the images.
All right. If that's it, I would like, let's give Gary a final round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much,
It was a real joy.
Gary.
It was a walk down memory lane. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, first big announcement. Next month is our last of the season lectures here. June 21st, Tuesday evening, just like tonight, 7 p.m. And we're going to have a program by Dorothy Korwick, our guest this evening. She will talk about the John Nolan Plan Historic District of Venice, Florida. And she was intimately involved in that definition and the eventual placement of that district into the National Register of Historic Places, along with her colleague. I didn't write them down. Oh, no, I didn't write it down. Your colleague on that. I don't remember. Carl? Yeah. Yeah, he was with the State Office of Historical Resources as a preservationist. And it was she produced a book the year after it was placed on the register. Wonderful book. I got one early on with her signature on it, and it's now one of my go-to references at home when I'm looking up background material. But anyway, Dorothy will talk about that district, and I assume the placement on the National Register, the process we went through for that. So 1 month from now, our last one of the season, if you can, please come. We'd love to have you. Basically, that's it. Another reminder, Carol Bailey is out there ready to sell a few more of these books on John Nolan, Landscape Architect and City Planner by Dr. Bruce Stevenson. who led the tour of the parks here. So feel free to consider that. And we do have one more item that I was told about right before I got up here. Joan High has made reference to a quilt that has been designed and is available for, you can do it like a raffle or an auction.
$5 for one chance, and we're only going to sell 100 tickets, and it's a fabulous quilt. It's all handmade by the Quilters Guild, and it's all service-related, every
All right. Are you set up out there to, all right. You see Joan about this quilt that's be up for raffle. And with that, a final thank you to our academic scholars and to family member that came. We appreciate your being here and hope you enjoyed the program and have a few refreshments before you walk out the door, but if not, have a good and safe week. Thank you.